Okay, so we have cost increase again being the major shifter. Just one more I'll mention is kind of related to that. If you have an improvement in technology, something's making you more productive. And again, we're talking about from the macro perspective, so not just one firm getting better technology, but some kind of overall technology improvement in the economy or firms as a whole getting more productive. So over time, productivity tends to increase. That is going to increase short run aggregate supply. So firms, for whatever reason, are willing to produce more, want to produce more at any given price level. So better technology kind of has a similar effect as lowering your costs. So remember, a cost increase is a shift to the left, a decrease would be a shift to the right. So better technology, higher productivity, increase short run aggregate supply. Okay, so our last curve is going to be long run aggregate supply. And remember, in the short run, what makes it the short run is that you have those sticky wages. So some of those costs are sticky in the short run. Well, in the long run, by definition, all prices and costs are flexible. So if you have a long enough time period, wages eventually adjust. Anything else that was sticky eventually can adjust. So in the long run, output does not depend on the price level. So it's just dependent on other factors. And so this level of output Y1 we sometimes call potential output. So it's how much your economy can produce given its current resources, given its current technology. Kind of at this snapshot in time, we can produce this much output, at least on a sustainable basis. So we'll see that we can get past this in the short run. But then in the long run, we would hope that our economy is getting more productive over time, so this will shift in the long run. But right now, this particular point in time, that's our level of potential output. It's also called full employment output or full employment GDP, meaning that all of our labor in our economy is fully employed, which doesn't mean zero unemployment, but we're at the natural rate of unemployment. So, what determines this level of output? Like I said, resources and technology, essentially. Anything that could affect productivity, something like that. So real factors as opposed to just changes in spending. So a spending change by itself would not shift your long run curve. So, but it has to be real factors such as resources, technology. It could even be things like the institutions that make up your economy that allow you to produce a certain level of output. So once we put all these curves together, then basically we have our model. So like I said, we have short run and driven by sticky wages. That's what gives us that shape. We talked about the factors that give us downward sloping aggregate demand. In the long run, everything's flexible, and so we're at full employment. That is going to be your, so if you're in long run equilibrium, you're going to be right at that point on your long run curve. So you're always going to be in short run equilibrium, but here we're also in long run equilibrium. All right, so we're going to go through basically a couple of possible scenarios that we use this model for. Most common one being something causing us to go into recession. So a negative demand shock. A shock just meaning like an unexpected, shift in one of these curves. So negative demand shock, something causes spending to decline. We're not too concerned about what leads up to that. But something causes, remember one of those reasons that could be shifting aggregate demand. Something causes aggregate demand to fall. And as soon as we're below Y1, that full employment output, we're basically going to call that a recession. So regardless of how big this drop is, we're going to think of that as being a recession as soon as we fall below Y1. So here we're at Y2 at this price level, and so essentially we're in a recession. So a couple things might happen at this point. If you did nothing, now remember what's happening here is that because wages are sticky on the downside here, right? Firms are not immediately cutting their wages to respond to this drop in spending and drop in output. So since wages are stuck, then firms are less profitable, they're cutting output, they're laying off workers. We assume that anytime we go into recession, we're going to have some unemployment here. So unemployment is going up, firms are reducing production, laying off workers, and so that's the movement here along your short run aggregate supply curve. Remember, so wages are stuck at some level while the prices of everything are going down, so firms are less profitable. And so if we just wait around, eventually wages will adjust. So we're here in recession, there's high unemployment. Workers are going to be willing to accept lower wages. You got a bunch of unemployment people, willing to work for lower wages. And also the fact that price level is lower means eventually workers are willing to accept wage cuts, right? Once they kind of adjust to the fact that the price level is lower. So if we just wait around for that wage adjustment, remember, nominal wage adjustment is one of the things that shifts short-run aggregate supply. It's now affecting costs. So as soon as those costs end up actually falling, then that firms are willing to increase their output again, and that's basically what gets us out of recession. So this is called the self-correction process, because we're just kind of waiting around for the adjustment to happen here. So this is the wage adjustment that is increasing your short-run aggregate supply and then moving you along this new aggregate demand curve. And now we're back in long-run equilibrium at this level. I didn't draw the price level over here, but that's your new long-run equilibrium, right? So nothing else changes. We're just kind of hanging out there until some other shock happens. So the other alternative is, we're here in recession, is for the government to step in and do some kind of policy response. So remember, fiscal policy is increase spending, cut taxes. That's going to increase aggregate demand, or increase the money supply. That's also going to increase aggregate demand. So at least in terms of our model, it's very easy to deal with a negative demand shock, at least on paper, right? Because all you got to do is, okay, aggregate demand fell, well, we just need to increase aggregate demand, right? So whenever we're talking about policy option, we're always talking about aggregate demand shift. So remember, there are things that can shift short-run aggregate supply, but we're always talking about policy addressing aggregate demand, because that's the most straightforward way of doing it. So either fiscal expansion, monetary expansion, increase aggregate demand, and now we're back to long-run equilibrium over here. Right, so that's really your two options with your negative demand shock. You could also have a positive demand shock. So let's say we're in a boom period, people are spending more, increased aggregate demand. So we can go past this full employment output. However, it's not going to be sustainable given the state of our economy, because remember, sticky wages. So now that wages are stuck, firms are like, okay, this is cool. My costs have stayed the same. Everyone's buying more, driving up the price level. We're profitable, so we're in this boom period here. And so we have very low unemployment. Output is higher than that sustainable rate, that full employment output. So this is not a long-run equilibrium. We're in short-run equilibrium whenever we're where these two curves are crossing, but this is not a long-run equilibrium, because eventually things are going to adjust. So wages are not stuck forever. In this boom economy, firms are going to have to pay workers higher wages. Unemployment's really low. Workers have a lot of bargaining power here. So eventually, this is going to push nominal wages higher. Right? Remember also the fact that price level is higher, which means workers are going to demand higher wages to keep up with those higher prices, just so that they're as well off as before. So once wages finally do adjust, this is now the self-correction process to a positive demand shock. You're going to have this nominal wage increase, short-run aggregate supply decreases, and now this is our new long-run equilibrium at this higher price level. Now, one thing we should keep in mind in kind of interpreting this model is that even though in the long run it doesn't really matter what your price level is, we do want to think of it as we kind of want to avoid inflation, for especially ongoing increases in inflation. So even though this is the price level, which is not really the same thing as inflation, a lot of times we'll interpret this as if we could interchange the price level with the inflation rate. So the inflation is a growth rate of the price level, as opposed to just the level itself. So even though we're going to label this as price level, sometimes we're going to think of this as the inflation rate, as working the same way as the inflation rate. Because if it was just a level change, then in the long run that doesn't really matter. Everyone could just adjust to the new level. But if we interpret this as an inflation rate, well, we don't really want inflation to keep creeping up every time we have a positive demand shock, because then the next time spending increases, now we're here, and then inflation's even higher. So the Federal Reserve, the central bank, is going to want to keep inflation from continuing to rise. So that's why we might want to have a policy response once we get to this point with a positive demand shock, as opposed to just letting it adjust like this. So the other option with a positive demand shock is, well, let's not let the price level get out of control here. We don't really want it to go up. We kind of just want to hang out here in long-run equilibrium if we can. And again, in a growing economy, we're not going to stay here forever, but just in this particular snapshot. But so we don't really want the price level to keep increasing. So let's just use contractionary policy in this case. and just, we know this is going to be an unsustainable rise in GDP, so let's contract and just keep it here in long run equilibrium. So fiscal contraction, reduce spending, or cut taxes, or sorry, raise taxes, right? Reduce spending or raise taxes, or monetary contraction, right? Reduce the money supply, decrease aggregate demand. So we could do that to deal with a positive demand shock.